All right. Well, Yuma, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us. Welcome to this PROACT webinar, Integrity in Politics. Is that still a thing? I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we meet on here in the ACT, Ngunnawal country, and the many other places around Australia, South Australia, and I'm sure other parts as well. My name's Claire Dubé. I'm one of the founders of PROACT. We're a community organisation in the ACT, which is about trying to reconnect people and politics, rejigging the kind of representation we have in Parliament and ensuring it's really embedded in the community. So kind of based on that kind of Voices for Indi model. But for us, we're looking at one of the Senate seats here in the ACT and keen to support a community-based independent senator at the next federal election. And as part of these discussions, we've been having kind of conversations across the ACT about what matters to people and what sort of politics they want. And it's clear that climate change has come up as a really big issue. But second to that, issues around integrity in politics, whether that's the kind of corruption issues and calls for a federal integrity body, or behaviours that we hear of that sound pretty horrendous, lack of transparency, whether that's in, not getting access to documents, or secret court cases, or trust fund payments perhaps, or a lack of accountability, and a real sense that people are tired of this, that it doesn't need to be like this, that there is a better way of doing democracy. And so along that train, I'm delighted to have here with me tonight two speakers, Senator Rex Patrick and Amy Remeikis. It's lovely to have you here and be part of the discussion. What we might do is hear from each of you and then open the floor up for some questions. So those of you who do have questions, feel free to type those in as we go along, and we'll come to those in the second part of the discussion. As always, please stick to the topic and stay respectful, as I'm sure everyone will. So first of all, if I could turn to you, Senator Rex Patrick, thank you very much for joining us. Just as a little bit of introduction, Senator Patrick has a background in the Navy as well as in his own business, worked for Senator Nick Xenophon, and then became a senator for South Australia in 2017. So over to you, Senator Patrick.
Look, thank you very much, and I really do appreciate the invite. It's one of my favourite topics, integrity and transparency. The two of those things go very much hand in hand. The other one might be submarines, but we'll park that to one side for a moment and focus on the topic at hand. Look, I have great concern. It worries me that there has been this sort of lack of confidence, lack of trust in politicians, particularly when I sit in the Senate chamber surrounded by people who are generally pretty good people. People enter politics, they're there to do the right thing. They just get caught up in a system where they're trapped by party lines, and in order to make their way to the top, they have to learn about all sorts of compromise and perhaps act in ways that they're not comfortable in doing so. And just to give you a simple example, I often walk into the chamber for a vote. As an independent, I have to know what we're voting on, what bill, what amendment. I'll sit next to my Labor or Liberal colleague and say, do you know what we're voting on? And they don't. What they're doing is following the whip. They simply look to see where the whip is on their side is sitting, and that's the side that they go and sit on. That in itself raises questions of integrity, because most people are elected to represent their electorate, in the case of someone from the House of Reps, or alternatively their state if it's someone in the Senate. So that's a problem. We also have much more serious issues of corruption, and of course, one of the remedies for that is a federal ICAC, and that's something that's been very topical over the last week or so. And there's been this sort of ongoing and persistent push to have a federal ICAC. The fact we've got ICACs all around the country in each of the state jurisdictions, and yet we somehow think that that the federal politicians are above all of that, I think is ludicrous. We need to push for an ICAC. It needs to have teeth. I described to one journalist today my view of the bill that is likely to be tabled by the coalition as a watchdog without teeth, with one ear, blind, a limp, on a very, very short leash. And that's not the sort of watchdog that we want to have over our federal parliament and federal officials. I'll move very quickly now to issues of transparency. That's another big area where I think there's great importance. I look at things like Senate estimates, where we ask questions of officials. Most people watch Senate estimates and think, well, this is good. People are being held to account. They're being made to be transparent by answering questions. I actually like the idea that it's bigger than that, in that when people leave the Senate and go back to their workplaces, for the next 2 or 3 months before the next estimates, every decision they make, they ask the question, could I explain this at Senate estimates? So I say all of the action, all of the benefit generally flows when Senate estimates is not sitting or not occurring, because people are mindful that they may have to explain themselves. Issues such as secrecy, big issue for me. People will know that I took the Prime Minister on in relation to National Cabinet. Big believer that if you want to make good decisions, you've got to have the best information. You've got to engage people. You've got to bring people along. We can't have people making decisions that are that affect people's liberties and not have any access to the rationale behind those decisions. And I think our Prime Minister and our Premiers ought to be able to stand and say, I voted in favour of this, or I voted against this. I don't think that brings any harm to the forum that is National Cabinet. Other issues, FOI. The FOI system is very broken, led from the culture at the top. Most people put in an FOI and the department will, whichever department it is, will issue a very cavalier decision that exempts almost everything, knowing full well that to appeal it, it has to go to the Information Commissioner, which generally will take a couple of years to get through. And by that time, the information is no longer valuable. The issue has passed. Sometimes there's been an election in between, or the decision to which the information related to has already been made, and people have moved on, and there's no chance then to engage. And then at last resort, if the 2-year process with the Information Commissioner hasn't basically rendered the information useless, the government then appeals it to the AAT, where it will take another year to get a result. So that system is completely broken, and there's a number of things that I'm trying to do in background in relation to that. There's also issues of political donations. I think this is a big area of corruption. One might call it political corruption, but you know what? If you take money and that persuades you to change your view on something in order to perhaps build up a war chest such that you can get re-elected, that's wrong. I receive donations. My rule is you've got to like what I do, and if you do, you can support me, but you can't buy me. And unfortunately, the way our elections work, advertising, the need to do social media, to put up call flutes, all those sorts of things requires money, and the donation system, I think, is fundamentally broken. I think there ought to be security checks for our ministers. Right now there aren't, because they consider ministers to be also politicians, and we don't, for reasons of separations of power, We don't get checked by the executives as to whether or not we can be MPs or senators. But ministers they wear two hats: one as a member or a senator, and the other, of course, as the head of an executive department. And in my view, they ought to be security checked, just like everybody else who has regular daily access to highly sensitive information. I think we need to combat foreign interference. I think that's another area where that touches into integrity and the operations of Parliament House and government. And finally, perhaps just to round it up, we also need to look at things like our intelligence agencies that are conducting operations. They use lots of powers that have been granted to them by the Parliament to ensure that we are kept safe. I generally don't have problems with a power being granted. I do have problems with a power being granted when the appropriate checks and balances don't sit beside that grant of power. And that's another area. I think that whilst we have the Inspector General of Intelligence and Security conducting checks on our intelligence services, we see in the situation like the bugging of the East Timor Embassy, where if the order had come from the Cabinet, the Inspector General is not allowed to question that order, even though the order may well have involved a conspiracy to defraud or something like that. I think we have to allow our elected officials, as they do in the UK, the US, New Zealand and Canada, to have oversight of the operations of our intelligence services. Again, that way, if our intelligence services want to exercise a particular power, they're mindful that they will be called to account by elected officials. So that sort of rounds up a whole range of areas that might be open to discussion after Amy's weighed in as well.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And I love this idea of this, the threat of Senate estimates. It's something that I think would ring very true to many in the audience, considering we are such a public service town. So thank you very much. I might now turn to Amy. Amy Remeikis is Guardian Australia's political reporter. Many of you will know her with the driving the Politics Live blog while Parliament's on, but also from other appearances, TV, radio, and of course Guardian Australia political commentary. So thank you very much for joining us, Amy.
No, thank you for having me. And I don't have much to add to what the Senator has already said there, except that when it comes to reporting, there are a lot of barriers because of the way that the systems have been set up. So one of the biggest barriers is defamation when it comes to reporting what is happening in the Parliament that may not be happening inside the Parliament but around it. Australia's defamation laws are really stacked against media and reporting and that sort of thing. Truth is not necessarily a defence. So it makes it particularly difficult from our point of view when we're trying to come up against systems, but we have to have absolute concrete proof, almost documentary, in order to be able to say, this is something that's happened. So that's not an overarching issue. When Senator Patrick there was talking about FOIs, he's completely right. The system is completely broken. You can ask for all correspondence, memos, talks, briefings, that sort of thing. They can just say no for no reason. Then you have to try and appeal that. It goes on for a very long time. An issue that's popped up with this particular Parliament is that every time there's a ministerial reshuffle and a minister moves on, any FOI that you had in place for that minister just dies, just goes away. You've got no hope of finding out any background to decisions that they made because they're no longer the minister, which makes it very difficult trying to prosecute any particular issues, because and I know that there's a lot of angst over media press conferences, but from the federal perspective, there is a big group of us, all with different outlets, but also different focuses, different states that we have to represent, different people who we're trying to get answers for. And we don't get a politician in front of us all that often in Canberra, which seems counterintuitive. But unless Parliament is sitting, the politicians, particularly the ministers, are all over the country. So we only really get the ministers and the Prime Minister when they're in Canberra. And when that happens, you've got a big group of people asking all of their own questions at once. By the time you get to the press conference, if you've been trying to prosecute an issue, you have gone to try and get FOI, you've probably been denied that, or you've received a document that's so redacted you wonder what you spent all your money on because you've got absolutely nothing from it. You've tried the department has given you a couple of lines that doesn't actually address any of your questions. You've gone to the minister's office, it's the same thing. You may have been bounced around from department to minister's office. Nobody is answering your question. So by the time that you actually get them in front of you, you have to rush out some sort of question, which they just kind of bat off. And then everybody asks you why you didn't prosecute that, why you didn't push further on that. And you've tried, you just can't force them to answer. And there's no system where you can force them to answer. I mean, like Senator Patrick can speak about this much more authoritatively than I can, but even the Senate asking a minister to bring documents, to produce documents, doesn't necessarily work because they come up and say, oh, well, that's cabinet in confidence, so we can't talk about that. So you never actually get answers. And it's the same with Senate estimates. You might have a little bit more freedom to have an issue prosecuted or at least probe it. But again, it comes back to, were they cabinet deliberations? Is this something that you can actually ask this departmental head? And the ministers run interference for the department while you're actually sitting there in Senate estimates. Depending on who the committee head is as well, they will also run interference for whoever is in front of the questions. And it just becomes like this big quagmire of just mess and opaqueness that you can't actually find a way through to. So the Integrity Commission that we're all talking about is a perfect example of that. It's been, I think the Labor line is like, more than 1,000 days since they promised a Federal Integrity Commission. We're still arguing over whether or not there actually is meant to be a Federal Integrity Commission, whether it's actually, something that the federal politicians need. The model that the government has put forward, as Senator Patrick has pointed out, actually doesn't do anything. It wouldn't do anything for any of the recent scandals that you could think about. It doesn't look at ministers. It basically doubles up on the job that we already have the police and the crime commission already looking at in terms of, prosecution and whether it's a legal criminality issue, where we know that so much of it may not necessarily be criminality, but it's something that is worth probing. So we're now having an argument where you're going to have the government put forward its bill for the Federal Integrity Commission, and if the Parliament doesn't support it, they're going to say, well, we tried and you guys didn't like it, and so what else can we do? When really what overwhelmingly I know Guardian readers and people on social media talk to me about is how they actually want something, as Senator Patrick said, with teeth. They want something that will actually be able to probe these sorts of issues. But instead, we seem to be going backwards because of what's happened in New South Wales. We're now even questioning whether ICAC goes too far, even though I think they had something like 2,400 allegations put forward to them in the last year, and they only progressed with something like 9. I'd have to check, on that. But the corruption commissions that we have such a high standard that you have to reach before you even get to an investigation standard. It's something that I don't think a lot of people understand, and something that I think politicians are really starting to exploit as they start to push back against why there doesn't need to be a federal integrity commission. When it comes to political donations, we've had people cry out for years now to have real-time donations, so we at least know who is donating to whom and when and how. That's something that we're still not seeing, even though we are starting to see it, in the States. There's just such a, and I read this term the other day, and it just seems to really apply to what is happening in Australian politics, at least from a reporter's point of view, or at least from my point of view, is ethics norming, where we are relating every single scandal and every single conspiracy on the same level, because we all are scandaled and controversy fatigued, and we all expect politicians are going to do the wrong thing anyway. So when you start to see reports on politicians who may have done the wrong thing, or whether there are questions to answer over something that they've done, people en masse tend to just be a bit like, oh, well, they're all the same. And one of the issues I struggle with when it comes to reporting on transparency and integrity in politics is how you convince people that, no, it's not all the same. Like, something that we're talking about, here is not necessarily something that we're talking about here, and you can't do a false equivalence between the two issues. But yet that seems to be, as a collective, where we have landed. We expect the wrong thing to be done. We're tired of hearing about scandals. So we all just kind of just go, oh, well, what are you going to do? And I think that's one of the biggest issues that, my industry has to try and overcome, is just this ethics norming of what has happened in politics.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I mean, it really is a bit of a depressing picture, isn't it? And I mean, this kind of, I guess if as an outsider, we look in and we see this sort of, it seems like an erosion of transparency, of accountability, etc. And I just see a message coming up, we're tired of it. Yes, it is very depressing. And I guess for me, well, the question is then, as two insiders, working within Parliament, different perspectives, what's been the cause of that erosion? Is it not having the systems in place? Is it cultural? Is it leadership? What's the basis for that?
I think, I'm sure Senator Patrick has some views of, what's happened with, some of his colleagues within the chamber and stuff. But for me, and I'm not old enough to have reported or remember, but from what history has shown me, is that when John Howard went from basically having really high ministerial standards, you breached those standards, then you had to go. And we saw just a rash of resignations because ministers were falling short of the ministerial standards that John Howard had put in place. So instead of raising the caliber of minister, we lowered the standard. And we've just seen a continual lowering of that standard since then, to the point where you almost don't have to resign over anything now. There is a reason and a justification for all behaviour and all questions, and anyone who even has been in a scandal in recent parliaments has managed to make their way back into the ministry fairly easily after a short amount of time, in what, Barnaby Joyce is now calling like near dead man's land, where you have to watch the Comcars come in and out. And, he means the backbench. But when we've seen this lowering of the ministerial standards rather than raising up ministers to actually meet it, it just seems to have caused this bit trickle-down effect. Whereas now, I don't know what you would need to have somebody actually resign from the federal parliament, like what evidence or what questions would need to be raised, because we seem to have reached a point where, there's a justification and a reason for just kind of brazening out everything.
Mm. Senator Patrick, what's your take on the cause of this?
Yeah, look, I think you have to look at this and direct a lot of it at leadership. Most of the people I work with in the parliament, backbenchers, but I also, as a crossbencher, work with ministers. Most of the people are good people, and some fall into traps, I think, and it might be hubris when as they make it into a ministerial role. You know, a lot of them have to sit back and not say very much at all, rely on the party remaining in power, do good work within the party, and eventually get to a ministry position. And once they get there, that's it; they're in charge. And you know, I think in circumstances where at the very top you don't have a leader enforcing standards that are applied, or standards that are written down, that becomes hugely problematic. But I think in all circumstances, just as we have the media watch us, we can have the judiciary deal with us if there's some allegation, civil or criminal. Every tier of government needs to have some sort of overwatch. The media can do some good work with us, but Amy's already indicated there were some of the problems that are there. You know, something happens and suddenly there's a police raid that simply deters everyone from playing the watchdog, which is why something like an integrity commission is so very important. Because it means that we are watched. We've got to make sure the power balance is right. Again, we've got to make sure that you don't have an ICAC that runs off and operates beyond power, and that has occurred in the past. So there's a combination of, in my view, poor leadership and the lack of an integrity body sitting over that is the fundamental cause of this problem.
Thank you. There's been a couple of questions come in around the role of independence, and Senator Patrick, I guess one aspect was wondering, do independents have the same kind of challenges as Amy mentioned around getting the information that is needed?
Oh, look, independents are always time poor because we don't have a big machine that looks after each aspect of responsibilities that are assigned to parliamentarians. So, for example, I have to look at every piece of legislation, and at the same time, I have to take on all of my constituent issues, all the policy issues that are important to me. So I just end up having no time, which can be frustrating. But in terms of things like, Amy mentioned orders for productions of documents, the Senate has these awesome powers to be able to do all manner of things in relation to its oversight role, but it can only be done with a majority of senators. So even if I want to pursue something, if I want to access to a document, I then have to get, technically 39 or 38 other senators to vote with me. And that's not always easy. And then if the government comes back and says, look, there's some sensitivities to this, the Gaetjens report, for example, the sensitivity there was that it had gone to the Prime Minister's dirty little secrets committee, which is called the Governance Committee of Cabinet. I don't know why we have a Governance Committee of Cabinet, because in my view, all those governance issues should be matters sorted out by the leader, but because they go to the Governance Committee of Cabinet, they then become very difficult to get access to. Now, I'll give you an example of how I tried in one instance to get to overcome this, and this is might be telling a little bit of behind the scenes story. When the Gaetjens review was ordered to be produced to the Senate, and the government refused, I proposed a motion to have Matthias Cormann, as the leader of the government in the Senate, have to sit on the front bench, not at the table of the Senate. Anyone who's watched the Senate will see, Simon Birmingham now and Penny Wong sitting at the table, and then all the front benches sit behind. So I moved a motion that said until such time as the report was produced, that Senator Cormann would have to sit on the front bench. I can tell you that probably sent his texting into overload as he tried to talk down the entirety of the crossbench. The first challenge I had was to go to the Labor Party and say, will you support? They're always reluctant to support those sorts of things because they worry about what precedents that might set and what may happen when they're in government. But in that instance, I did get them on board. The Greens came on board relatively easy. And in fact, I got all of the crossbenchers to sign the motion. And unfortunately, at the last minute, Pauline Hanson changed her mind and I lost on the numbers. But even something as simple as that, trying to get access to that document, it would have been a nice thing to see Matthias sitting on the front bench, carrying out his roles as leader of the government from that front bench, because everyone would have, every time they saw that, they would have thought, the Gaetjens review, the Gaetjens report hasn't been provided to the Senate. Look, so that, that's an example of an attempt I've made to really push the issue. I currently am seeking access to all of the companies with a turnover of more than $10 million that received JobKeeper and how much they received. It's a transparency issue in New Zealand. They publish this information on a website, and we've seen in New Zealand about 5% of JobKeeper has been returned. Here in Australia, it's 0.25%. I've managed to get the order through the Senate. Unfortunately, the Tax Commissioner has not complied with that order. It's a lawful order, and in fact, it puts him in a position of contempt. But I'm going to have to struggle to get the numbers to refer the Tax Commissioner to the Privileges Committee, who then may or may not do something to get access to the documents that the Senate has ordered. So even though we theoretically have great powers, in 1954 or 56, the House of Reps put 2 journalists in jail, inappropriately in my view. The journalists had wrote some nasty things about the government at the time, and I think journalists should be allowed to do that. But the House of Reps put 2 people in the Goulburn jail, went to the High Court on a writ of habeas corpus, and the High Court ruled that, of course, the Senate does, or sorry, both houses of Parliament have that sort of power. So we have this extraordinary power, but you've got to get the numbers on board, and sometimes you're frustrated by parties that say, well, we're a party of government, we've got to be very careful. On other occasions, you confront people who just simply change their mind on a regular basis.
We've had a few more questions coming in around the role of independence. So maybe we'll talk about that a little bit more and then move on to some other topics. I know there's also interest about kind of what sort of reforms that might be possible. But just on the role of independence, I wonder first to you, Amy, and whether you've seen any different in terms of these issues around integrity, transparency, accountability. The picture that you painted previously was talking more broadly. What about in relation to your engagement with independence?
Well, again, it depends. It depends on the independent, and that's probably one of the biggest things to consider when it comes to independence, because political parties, you tend to know what you're getting as a platform, as a voter. When it comes to independence, they may have run on a couple of issues, but you don't necessarily know where they stand on everything. And sometimes it can be a surprise where they end up voting on something, particularly in a situation where they hold the balance of power. So it's a huge responsibility and a huge amount of power that maybe 1 or 2 people hold, because it can tip legislation either way. And we saw that with the Medivac vote in the last Parliament. That was really pushed on by independents, and then we saw that go through. But then you've got this situation in this parliament and I'm talking about the House in particular, where you have a very strong coalition of like-minded independents who are really starting to push issues from the crossbench. And one of the main issues that they are pushing is an integrity commission. So you have Zali Steggall and Helen Hames, in particular, but then you've also got Andrew Wilkie, Adam Band from the Greens is also part of this very big push, Rebecca Sharkey, all of them coming together to put bills into the parliament, which is not something that you've really seen before, at least in my time covering politics, where you've seen this coalition of independents saying this is something that we're going to push and this is something that we're going to support. So it has actually dragged the major parties into a position on what they're going to do, because it means that it is constantly being reported on. It is something that communities are being talked to with, particularly in the independent communities where they're really starting to push it. And you're starting to see that organisation spread out with the voices of movement that we're seeing across a lot of key Australian electorates, and also just people starting to say, well, hang on, what are we doing about this? And then in response, you were seeing the major parties having to respond. Now, Senator Patrick would have seen that play out in the Senate as well, because it's a lot easier, numbers were standing, to get a bill up in the Senate than it is to get it up in the House. It's a lot easier to bring on the debate for that as well. If one of the major parties is at least in favour of causing a little bit of trouble for the government of the day, it's a lot easier to get these things talked about in the Senate, which really starts to drive that conversation, even if you're not seeing the results necessarily in legislation.
Thanks. And Senator Patrick, there's a question of how much of a difference would it make if there was more independence in the Senate with you?
Oh, look, it certainly would make it more problematic for the government to get legislation across the line. But actually, that's quite a good thing. What happens is, I don't know how connected your participants are in relation to the House and what happens in the Senate. I like to tell kids when they visit Parliament that just in the House, the government always has the numbers, and they can pass a bill that bans kids eating chocolate, for example. That can get through very easily. Of course, when it gets to the Senate, we will look at that and say, well, that's a controversial bill, and we'll send it to a Senate inquiry, and we'll get input from dentists and teachers and children and parents and chocolate manufacturers and so forth. And we'll either end up supporting the bill, amending it, or rejecting it outright. But in general, you end up with better legislation because of that. Having more independence can potentially make that more complex. I think the nice thing about us independents is we're not constrained. I like the idea, and I won't mention names, but there are some crazy independents as well, and there have been in the past. There may well be some viewed as a little bit crazy. I kind of like the idea that every Australian can look into the Senate and see someone who they can relate to. So that's also another thing you get out of independence. In the Senate, as is the case in the House, again, I sit next to colleagues who are Labor or Liberal, and they'll whisper to me, Rex, I really, really hate this. I really think this is broken, but they're bound to vote with the party because it's all about the numbers. And that's again a sort of corruption of the way in which our constitution is supposed to work. Again, having more independence would permit the better use of numbers, but again, it would potentially give the government more places to go to get the votes that they need. So that can be a bit of a lottery as well.
Thank you. We've also had some questions about what kind of reforms are needed, and a question around, what you think, Senator Patrick, around the appointments to the Administrative Appeals Tribunal. and how do we strengthen mechanisms, accountability mechanisms around freedom of information, around the AAT, around the National Audit Office, Ombuds, all of these different bodies and processes that are meant to work for accountability, and yet are not quite doing so at the moment.
Yeah, look, there's a whole range of different things that can be done. Look, where do I start? I moved an amendment in the last sitting week to a courts and tribunals bill that basically was a recommendation of Justice Callanan in his review of the AAT that basically said that unless you're in the sort of commercial and tax division of the AAT, before you could get appointed, you needed to be a lawyer with 5 years of practicing experience. And I think that's important because most people, when they want to challenge a government decision, would like to think that when they sit in the AAT, they've got a competent adjudicator. Labor didn't support me on that. And, one of the reasons they didn't was because it wasn't the perfect solution. They have a better solution that they want to put in place when they get into government. And look, I say they can still do that when they get into government, but for the short term, let's just not let perfect be the enemy of the good. In relation to things like FOI, I don't know if you're aware, but I actually have now initiated proceedings in the federal court I'll preface this by saying I actually like the Information Commissioner. I think she does a really good job, but she's just overwhelmed. And so I've put in an application into the federal courts, being a case that will be heard down in Melbourne, over my 22 Information Commissioner reviews, of which I think it's 19 of them have been more than 6 months in terms of getting an answer out. Some of them, I think it's 14 more than a year. 2 of them have taken more than 2 years, seeking a judicial remedy to force the Information Commissioner to either decide not to review it so I can go to the AAT, or alternatively force her to make a decision. Again, not a criticism of her, she's just overwhelmed. My hope is that A, sets a precedence for others to use, and secondly, it would hopefully cause the government to properly resource the office of the Australian Information Commissioner. So there's something I'm doing in that space. Obviously, ICAC is another thing. Amy mentioned crossbenchers in the lower house doing stuff on an ICAC. I can't say too much, but just watch this space in the next sitting week. You might see the crossbench in the Senate doing something very similar. Lots and lots of different things that we can do, and I could go on for some time, but there's just a taster.
We will certainly keep an eye on what's coming up in the next week or so then. That sounds interesting. I don't think we could talk about a topic like this without some reference to New South Wales politics of the last week or so. And one thing that I've found sort of interesting is the kind of narrative that has come out around not so much of the kind of that this is, an example of an integrity body doing its job, but rather what's wrong with ICAC. How do we kind of counter some of that narrative? And is part of the problem a kind of increasingly partisan fracturing of the media? Does that impact on the kind of accountability that and the role of the media in terms of accountability? Amy, did you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's been a really interesting one, to be part of, the media, inverted commas, watching it, but also just watching it play out from people on all sides of social media and people who aren't interested in politics at all. I think there has always been partisan media. I don't think anyone should be under any illusions about that. Journalists are humans who come to their job with fully formed opinions, and the idea that everyone manages to do their job without bias is probably quite an old-fashioned one, because people will read bias into your work even if it's not there, because everyone sees all information through their own experiences and through their own biases. So you tend to go to the organizations or work in the organizations that sit with your own values. And I think that that is probably something that has happened across the board for decades and decades and decades. So I don't think that's new. I think that what is new is that everyone tends to know what we're personally thinking about issues, because previously it was only really opinion writers or commentary writers where you got to actually hear their thoughts, but now everyone knows what everyone thinks on everything, because if you follow them on social media, you'll see some sort of monologue about what somebody thinks about something, or a quip or whatever. And of course, that colors how you then view their reporting. It might seem like a straight up and down report, but if you've been on Twitter being all like, you know, poor whoever, they were taken in by the wrong person, really going to miss them, of course you're going to read all of their reporting or listen to all of their reporting through that prism. And so that's one of the things that has changed. But again, it's what is happening with this ICAC discourse, putting aside, you know, any particular sort of, you know, individuals, because obviously that's coming up in hearings and we can't prejudice anything, and, you know, Australia's defamation laws, all the rest of it. But what this ICAC discourse, what's really struck me is how it's gone from, this is happening to somebody who I liked and respected, therefore, you know, perhaps the whole system is rubbish. And I think that is very dangerous. And we're starting to see quite a few federal politicians really start to push that message as well. Whereas we know that it's not, you know, it's not the Spanish Inquisition. It's not just randomly destroying careers. It's an investigation that does not think of guilt or innocence. It doesn't have the ability to do that. ICAC, like most of the corruption commissions in Australia, can only recommend that charges perhaps be laid. They can't say this person should be charged. That's still up to the judiciary. That's still up to the Department of Public Prosecutions, whether there is a charge that's even been laid. They don't decide whether you're innocent or guilty. They just investigate it and then they present the evidence. And we're now reached a point where we've decided that maybe even that investigation is going too far. And particularly when it comes to New South Wales politics, that's because we haven't actually seen a premier, like, you complete a term of premiership. In, like, I think 6 premiers now have had to resign ahead of, you know, when their term is finished, because of some sort of scandal or some sort of, like, you know, controversy that may or may not have involved ICAC. So I think you're now reaching a point where just saying, well, if ICAC isn't even really charging people, then what's the point of it? And then that's where it becomes really, really dangerous. And, like, from a personal point of view, and I'll wrap this up quickly, my family has actually been through a corruption investigation, not politics. It was related to my father. It was many, many years ago, and it was about information sharing. And it went on for years. And we were destitute because my father was the main breadwinner in our household and he couldn't work, couldn't get a job. So we went from having, like, a very working class income to no income at all. It was awful, went on for a very long time. And in the end, no charges were laid, you know, nothing ever happened. And we all just had to pick up the pieces of our lives and move on with it. Having been through that experience, I can understand when people say, like, you know, oh, these investigations can ruin lives. Do I think that the investigation still needed to happen? Absolutely. Yes, I did. Because maybe it wasn't maybe it didn't reach a point of criminality. Maybe my, like the experience that we went through, it wasn't to the point of having to lay criminal charges, or even that there was an opportunity to lay criminal charges. But did they come up a bit too close to that line when you're in a position where you've got power and access to information? Yes, absolutely. And for that reason, that is the reason we need to have integrity commissions. That is the reason why we need to have anti-corruption commissions, because we have so many people dealing with power and information and access that is not available to the general public. And we need to have trust that those systems and the people who work in them uphold the responsibility that comes with having that access to that information and that power. And if we don't have that, we don't have faith in the system. And if we don't have faith in the system, then where are we?
Absolutely. Where are we? I think that sums it up really. And not in a good space would be my answer to that. But hopefully, and we will look to what Senator Patrick gave us a little idea, there might be something coming up. So maybe that will give us some hope of some change down the track. There's also been a question around pork barrelling and where's the line between, and I think this was particularly for sort of independent crossbenchers, so where's the line between pork barrelling versus achieving results for your community? Senator Patrick?
Yeah, it can be a hard line to draw. My job is to advocate for South Australians, and I do so unashamedly. And if that, when I'm talking to a minister, and I want, and I think some money ought to be going to, some manufacturer in Whyalla, or to, someone in forestry down in Mount Gambier, because it will stimulate the economy, it will have benefit for everyone. Then I have no issues with saying that. I think the important thing is that when those sorts of when that sort of advocacy is made, that the decision makers, typically ministers, make those decisions on merit. We do see governments kick in and stimulate different parts of the economy from time to time. That's absolutely appropriate. To deal with issues associated with people who are in great need, trying to get help to those sorts of people. Where it becomes a problem is, as we've seen in things like sports rorts, where instead of advocating for a community for the benefit of the community, you advocate with the view that that advocacy might help someone in your party get re-elected. What we saw in sports rorts, where merit was clearly not the only factor. There were spreadsheets that talked about electorates, that matched electorates to political parties. At that point, you say that's inappropriate. And getting closer to an election, also you have to be much more careful about these sorts of allocations, because it is open to people suggesting that it is pork barrelling. So, pork barrelling is not okay. Advocating for a community, for a need, is okay, and but it ought to be completely transparent. People ought to see that Senator Patrick went along and he argued for a particular bit of funding to go somewhere. And generally, I tell people when I've done that. But the decision-making process also that sits behind that also needs to be transparent. And that's, again, one of the problems here is that, in relation to the car parks rorts, there's just people denying people access to information. If there's nothing to fear, then reveal that information. I say to people, look, there are very good reasons for secrecy, particularly around defence operations, intelligence operations, law enforcement operations, sometimes commercial considerations. But in general, everything the government does, it does for public purpose, and it does so with public funds. and they ought to be transparent about it. You know, in relation to tenders to these sorts of grants, sure, in the lead up, there ought not, there can be a case for confidentiality, but after the grants are awarded, actually one of the costs of receiving public money is transparency. Your organisation, if you're in receipt of public money, ought to be comfortable with the idea that your grant application will be shown to people, and people will be able to look at it and see whether or not it hits the merits test. So transparency, I think, is a big remedy to things like pork barrelling, and that to me is an area that needs to be looked at.
Absolutely, and thank you for that. We're running a little short on time now. I know that there's a number of other questions and lots of good comments in the chat, but we are coming to the end of time, so we're going to have to wrap it up there. But I would like to say a very big thank you to Senator Patrick and to Amy Remeikis for joining us tonight. I mean, I think on topics like this, it's easy to feel pretty despondent and depressed about the state of the world, but I do think at the same time there's been some good suggestions around things where there is improvements coming or the possibilities. So I hope there is that opportunity for change, and for us it's also about, here at ProAct, it's also about how we engage in politics, the choices that we make around that, the choices that we all make about how we vote, and the differences that can make. And thank you to all of you for joining today, and for the contributing to the discussion through your questions. If you'd like to know more about ProAct, check out the website, proact.org.au, follow us on Twitter, Insta, etc., ProAct CBR. And we invite you to join us and be part of this community groundswell for change. So thank you again, Senator Patrick and Amy Remeikis, and good night, everyone.